network that spans hundreds of kilometers and may prove to be their biggest weapon. We'll tell you all about it. In China, Xi Jinping changes tone, says he's willing to cooperate and manage differences with the US. iPhone maker Foxconn is under investigation. Is this China's way of meddling in the Taiwan election? In Pakistan, hundreds of flights have been grounded, but missiles are flying. We'll tell you their story of misplaced priorities. In South Africa, hundreds of miners have been stuck in a gold mine for 3 days, apparently as hostages. It's the stuff of movies. And Meta has been sued for hurting the mental health of people. We'll bring you all these stories and more. The headlines first. Israeli strikes hit Syria's Aleppo airport again, the fourth time in 2 weeks. The airstrikes also killed 8 Syrian troops. Israel says they are in response to rocket fire. Since last week, pro-Hezbollah groups in Syria have exchanged frequent cross-border fire with Israel. Another controversial Chinese ship arrives in Sri Lanka. Both India and the US have expressed concerns. Last year, New Delhi had objected to a Chinese ship docking in Sri Lanka. India believes China is using these so-called research ships to spy. India to restart issuing visas to Canadians. Business, medical and conference visa services to resume at India's Toronto and Vancouver consulates. Last month, New Delhi had suspended the services amid a diplomatic spat with the Trudeau government. Hong Kong's pro-China leader John Lee says they will create their own national security law in 2024. 4 years ago, Beijing imposed a similar law on Hong Kong. It was aimed at curbing dissent and came in response to pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong in 2019. Sudan's army agrees to fresh talks on ending the war. The conflict with the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces began in the month of April. The war has killed more than 9,000 people and displaced more than 5.6 million. The talks will be brokered by the US and Saudi Arabia. The first round of talks were called off in June. And Japan's Supreme Court delivers a landmark verdict on transgender rights. It rules that the transgender sterilization law is unconstitutional. The law requires transgender people to have their reproductive organs removed to change their gender.
The attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum.
The Secretary General must resign.
It's day 19 of the Israel Hamas War. The action has 2 theaters now. The first is in New York at the United Nations Security Council. The second is in Gaza, where the bombs continue to rain. Let's start with the political battleground. On Tuesday, the UNSC, the United Nations Security Council, held an open debate on this war. The first speaker was António Guterres, the United Nations chief. And he said the Hamas attack on Israel did not happen in a vacuum. In other words, Israel is also to blame.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished.
Israel is not taking that well. Guterres basically blamed them, the Israelis, for the Hamas attack. And that too at the United Nations Security Council. So Israel now says Guterres must resign.
The UN is failing, and you, Mr. Secretary General, have lost all morality and impartiality. Because when you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And I think that the Secretary General must resign. Because from now on, every day that he is here in this building, unless he apologizes immediately, today we called him to apologize, there's no justification to the existence of this building.
We understand what Guterres was trying to say, but his choice of words? Poor at best. He's now tried to clarify his remarks. Guterres says that he was not defending the Hamas attack, he was only speaking of Palestinian grievances. Let's see if Israel buys his clarification. Now, after Guterres, the UNSC members took turns. The US was represented by Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He said all acts of terror are unjustifiable, whether in Nairobi, Mumbai or New York. He was referring to the 26/11 attack on Mumbai in 2008. He also had a warning for Iran. Blinken promised swift and decisive action if US assets were targeted. But he did not call for a ceasefire. That demand came from the Muslim world. All of them rallied behind Palestine. Listen to this.
Iran aligned with international community in endorsing the call for an immediate ceasefire and a cessation of Israeli relentless military aggression.
It seems that Israel is above the law. It is violating international law without any deterrent. It is running roughshod over Security Council resolutions.
The international community must take a firm stance to end military operations, double standards and selectivity abiding by UN laws and resolutions. This policy has dangerous repercussions that go beyond this crisis.
Some prefer to look the other way in face of such atrocities. They prefer not to speak about crimes against humanity and war crimes. They prefer to pretend as if Palestinian people are just numbers and they have no souls and rights.
How about that? Iran, Turkey and Saudi Arabia on the same page. You don't see that every day. But how likely is a ceasefire, or at least a temporary truce? Well, there seem to be two proposals on the table. The US wants a pause in the fighting, not a ceasefire. They're calling it a pause, so that aid and resources can enter Gaza. Russia wants a ceasefire. They want Israel to stop the war. And both these countries have a veto power, meaning they can defeat the other's proposal. So where does that leave Gaza? Helpless. A UN Security Council resolution is binding. It puts pressure on Israel to stop the war. Without it, Israel can prepare for the ground invasion. And the US has made this clear, its position clear. It is not time for a ceasefire, says the US.
As I said from the beginning, we want to see all measure of protection for civilians, and pauses in operation is a tool and a tactic that can do that for temporary periods of time.
So does that mean
that is not the same as saying a ceasefire. Again, right now, we believe a ceasefire benefits Hamas, a general ceasefire.
Meanwhile, the situation in Gaza continues to get worse. Around 700 Gazans were killed in the last 24 hours, 700. The overall death toll is around 6,500, and half of them are children. I'll repeat that. Half of the fatalities in Gaza are children. If there is a ground invasion, that could increase. Most of Gaza is now just debris, piles of concrete, twisted metal and dust. Imagine living in this situation. It's a daily wait for the next Israeli airstrike, and when it hits, your worst nightmare begins. That's what happened in Gaza City. A father was trapped under the rubble after rockets destroyed his home. When rescuers got to him, he had just one question: is my family safe?
وانت 100% طلعوا هالقد كلهم عايشين في الشلال. تطلع يلا كلهم عايشين. مرتك طلعناها وامونا طلعناها وهلا طلعناها وامونا طلعناها وشرف امي في الشلال تضايق.
The hospitals are another horror story. The WHO says there are 35 hospitals in Gaza, 35. Out of them, 12 are shut down. Same with healthcare centers. 46 out of 72 healthcare centers are not functioning in Gaza. Medicines, food and power are low. Officials say hospitals are on the brink of total collapse. Fuel seems to be the biggest worry. Israel has blocked fuel deliveries into Gaza. As a result, power is running out. The United Nations says that operations in Gaza could end by tonight. And how will this affect patients? Well, no power means no ventilators, no life support. This could put 2,000 cancer patients at risk, also 130 premature babies. These babies cannot breathe on their own. They are in incubators. One video sums up how bad things are. It was shot at the Indonesian hospital in Gaza. It shows an ambulance arriving in complete darkness. No street lamps, no lights at the hospital. Everything is pitch black. Doctors had to light the way with their mobile phones. It tells you how bad the situation is. And this is before the ground invasion. We've been hearing about it since day one, the ground invasion, that Israel will invade the Gaza Strip. Well, the army says it's ready.
The IDF is ready for ground operations and will take a decision together with the political establishment regarding the manner and the timing of the next stage. We are conducting a war.
The army is ready. So what is the hold-up? There are multiple factors at play here. Number one, hostages. The Hamas still holds more than 200 people. Some of them are dual nationals. If Israel invades, their future is uncertain. So there is pressure from Western countries, including the US. They want Israel to delay the operation, to buy time and get the hostages out. Number two, the end game. Israel says it wants to eradicate the Hamas. Great. But what comes after that? Who do they leave in charge of Gaza? Reports say Benjamin Netanyahu has not decided on that. And that's a key issue. Defeating and eradicating are two very different things. Just ask the Americans. They defeated the Taliban in 2001. They occupied Afghanistan for 20 years. But in the end, the Taliban came back. Israel should be mindful of that. Number three, the cost of invasion. And I do not mean the financial cost. I mean the human cost. Israel is committing thousands of soldiers into a deadly battlefield. They don't know what Hamas has planned. Chances are it will be a tough urban war. And that means casualties. So you can't just rush in the door, because if you do, it could be a trap. And finally, reason number four, the fear of a wider war. The Hezbollah has already threatened to join this war. Invading Gaza would give them an excuse. Today, the Hezbollah chief held an important meeting in Lebanon. Leaders of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad also attended. And what did they discuss? A route to victory against Israel. So Israel could end up fighting a two-front war. And US support or not, that's a scary prospect. So Netanyahu is taking his time. His popularity is already low. Another bad decision could seal his fate. So 19 days of the war, 19 days since Hamas attacked Israel. And one question still remains unanswered. How did all of this happen? How did Hamas pull off the October 7th attack? How did Israel not see it coming? We still don't have an answer, but we've been following some clues and reports, and here are the four things that we've learned. One, Israel got warnings that it ignored. Two, their own intelligence failed. Three, once the attack happened, they failed to respond to the situation. And four, now Netanyahu and team are trying to bury all of this. Tonight, we want to tell you about Israel's comprehensive failure, starting with the tip-offs. They came from Egypt. Apparently, Cairo gave repeated warnings to Israel. An Egyptian intelligence official has been speaking about this. We don't know his identity, but we understand that he often mediates between Israel and Hamas. And he says the Israeli government was repeatedly warned. The message they were sent was this: Hamas is planning something big. And they did not leave it at that. They informed Prime Minister Netanyahu personally. Reports say Egypt's intelligence minister called Netanyahu. His name is General Abbas Kamel. And this call was apparently made 10 days before the Hamas attack. But Netanyahu denies all of it. His office insists that no such call came from Egypt. So it's his word against the Egyptians. Meanwhile, more Israeli officials are now speaking out, like this man, Amos Yadlin. He's a former Israeli intelligence chief, and he says Prime Minister Netanyahu was distracted. He was pushing a controversial judicial reform. It plunged the country into chaos. There was widespread protest in Israel. Even military reservists had turned against the government. And all of this weakened Israeli defenses. So did the warnings from Egypt slip through the cracks? Let me quote from what Yadlin said. Netanyahu got all the warnings from his defense minister, from the chief of staff, from the head of intelligence, from the head of Shin Bet, and from independent writers like me, like others, that this is weakening Israeli deterrence and endangering Israeli national security. So So he got the warnings apparently. Did the Prime Minister then drop the ball? It is now a matter of investigation. But this was just the first lapse. They did not pay heed to the warnings. That was the first lapse, a serious one. Israel's own intelligence failed to see what Hamas was up to. That is failure number 2. They used to have an aura of invincibility. The October 7 attack demolished it. Israeli spies were caught with their eyes shut. A preliminary assessment has found 2 lapses: communication and surveillance. Intelligence officials failed to track key channels, the ones that Hamas used, and the surveillance apparatus failed. Israel uses a lot of high-tech border surveillance equipment like sensors, cameras, and other espionage systems. Officials now say that this over-dependence on the systems cost them. Hamas exploited it. They shut down the systems, leaving the Israeli side blind, and then they launched the attacks. Then came the third lapse, the third failure, the military. They failed to respond. The Israeli military has done an internal review, and they found 2 gaps in their response. First, when the Hamas attack began, the Israeli army brass was clustered at a base near Gaza. All the top leaders converged there. And this slowed their response. They could not engage effectively with their teams. And gap number 2 was that they underestimated the Hamas. Israel tracks Hamas activities in Gaza. It listens to their conversations, and reports say they did pick up some chatter. They picked up statements like these, like, we are not preparing for battle. They heard Hamas leaders saying this, that they're not preparing for battle. And this should have raised red flags. But the Israelis took these statements at face value, and it proved to be disastrous. Now, all of this is being investigated. A government commission of inquiry will oversee the investigation. Reports say Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to, quote-unquote, rig the jury and to dictate who gets to sit on this panel. His critics say he is manipulating the commission. His ratings are falling. There are calls for him to resign. And this is a case study for the whole world. When it comes to security, you cannot afford complacency. Domestic politics cannot be allowed to compromise national security.
Galilee Medical Center.
Tell me about something about this hospital. What is the characteristics? It is the closest hospital near the border.
Yes, this is the closest hospital to any border of Israel. It's we're 6 miles from the Lebanese border, the northern border, and we serve a very diverse community of
more than 6 lakhs.
Yeah, we serve a community of about 660,000 people.
What is here you told me that even bomb can't destruct the structure.
Our emergency department is fortified and protected.
This is very protected.
Yes, so it can be completely closed.
This is like a shelter.
It is exactly a shelter. It is exactly a shelter. So the idea is to provide a structure that we can provide care, hopefully all the time in times of peace, but
and the time of war, because your country is in the time of war.
Yes, but also in the time of war. We want
Can you tell me something about the structure? कुछ बता सकती हैं? Can you
it's
tell?
built. You can see the very thick walls. It can be completely.
बहुत मोटी दीवारें हैं, देखिएगा. और कुछ है?
It's fortified. It's protected. It's essentially a bomb shelter.
From top also?
It's a bomb shelter essentially, and
ये बॉम्ब शेल्टर है, इमरजेंसी वार्ड है, लेकिन बॉम्ब शेल्टर की तरह भी इसका इस्तेमाल होता है. यहाँ अगर बॉम्बिंग भी हो, जिस तरह के रॉकेट हमास छोड़ता है दक्षिणी इलाके में या हिजबुल्ला छोड़ता है उत्तरी इलाके में, लेबनान इजराइल की बॉर्डर पे हैं, यहाँ कुछ भी
So Israel missed the red flags, but Hamas was not exactly shouting from rooftops. Their planning was extensive and secretive. It began almost 2 years ago, and reports say that tunnels in Gaza helped them. These tunnels run across the Gaza Strip. They also have phone lines inside. We're talking about the old school ones, the landlines. Hamas terrorists use these landlines to communicate. No mobile phones, no computers. The report says it was a small cell of terrorists. They stayed underground and they used these phones. And when the time was right, this cell was activated. Now, this report has not been officially confirmed, but it does add up. Israel constantly tracks Hamas leaders on their devices, so planning this over phone calls, mobile phone calls, would have been impossible, which is why Hamas used old school methods like landlines and meeting in person. Maybe that's why Israel was blindsided. But one thing keeps appearing in all such reports, whether it's about the planning or the communications or the hideouts, and that's the Gaza tunnels. It keeps coming back. Just how big is this network? Listen to this assessment by the Israeli army.
What Hamas has done since they took control almost 20 years ago of the Gaza Strip is basically to build a network of tunnels from Gaza City and under Gaza City, which is the center and the biggest part of their infrastructure, all the way down to Khan Yunis and Rafah. So imagine we're looking at the Gaza Strip, but really think of the Gaza Strip as one layer for the civilians and then another layer for Hamas. And what we're doing now is that we are trying to get to that second layer.
Now, Hamas says there are 1,300 tunnels below Gaza. The network is said to be 500 kilometers long. That's what Hamas claims, 500 kilometers. Some of them are up to 70 meters deep. Their width is around 2 meters. Now, to give you some context, the entire Gaza Strip is around 41 kilometers long. So Hamas's claim may not be right. Nonetheless, it's a major asset for them, these tunnels. The first tunnels were constructed during Israel's occupation of Gaza, a classic resistance strategy. More tunnels were built after the Hamas took over. Their primary aim was smuggling. Back then, Gaza was under a full blockade. Even the Egyptian border was not open. So Hamas used these tunnels to smuggle goods. Many of these led from Gaza to Israel. One such tunnel was discovered in 2013. It was 1.6 kilometers long, 18 meters deep. Residents at an Israeli border town complained of noises. That's when the tunnel was discovered. During wars, these are major threats. You can booby-trap tunnels. You can also use them for ambushes. So the IDF has repeatedly tried to target them. In the 2021 war, they had some success. The IDF said it destroyed 100 kilometers of tunnels. Even this time in this war, tunnels are a target. Reports say Israel is thinking about flooding them. You flood the tunnels, you flush out Hamas terrorists. But there's also a downside here. Hamas is holding hostages in these same tunnels. 2 of them were released this week. Listen to how they described it.
It looked like a spider's web. There were many, many tunnels. We started walking in the tunnels. The earth was moist and it was very humid. We reached a hall where 25 other people had also gathered.
So the tunnels are extensive, and if Israel invades, that could be a problem. Hamas is said to have different types of tunnels below Gaza, one for smuggling, one for defensive operations like communicating and storing weapons, and one for offensive operations. That last one can be used to launch attacks. So how can Israel tackle this? Historically, tunnel warfare has been impossible. You can't send in soldiers, it's like walking into an obvious trap. You also cannot use bunker buster bombs because above these tunnels are civilians. If you bomb the tunnels, you bomb the civilians. Plus, Israel does not really know where the tunnels are. They've mapped some parts of it, but the whole thing is hundreds of kilometers long. It's impossible to trace all of it. And Hamas will be counting on that. They have no chance against Israel in the battlefield. The IDF is better funded, better trained, and better organized. But down in the tunnels, it's a different game altogether. One that will be played on Hamas's terms. In the past, many groups have used this strategy, and with success, like the Viet Cong in northern Vietnam. They built a massive network of tunnels which kept the Americans out. Can the Hamas pull off something similar? That's another concern for the Israeli leadership. Now let's move from actual tunnels to diplomatic landmines. The China-Taiwan conflict seems to have claimed a new victim. Taiwan's multi-billion-dollar firm Foxconn. It is now under investigation in China. China has sent its tax authorities after the firm. They're investigating multiple Foxconn plants all over China, specifically the land use at these plants. Now, Foxconn is a big company. It is famous for manufacturing iPhones. It is a Taiwanese firm with major operations in China. This company is valued at over $75 billion. It employs more than 1.2 million people, just to give you the scale of how big this is. And now they're under investigation. The motives are political. China wants to meddle in Taiwan's presidential election through this. If you watch this show, you already know that the Taiwan-China equation is fraught. But I'll still give you a quick primer. Taiwan is a self-governed island. It's always been like that. It was never ruled by the Communist Party in Beijing. But Beijing sees Taiwan as a wayward province. And it has promised to reunify Taiwan with the mainland by force if necessary. Now, when a pro-China party is in power in Taiwan, tensions ease. But when a pro-independence party comes to power, China becomes hostile, which is the case right now. Since 2016, the DPP has been in power. It's a party that wants Taiwan's formal independence from China, the DPP. Obviously, Beijing does not like it. And now it sees an opportunity because Taiwan is going to polls next January, presidential polls. The leading candidate is this man, Vice President Lai Ching-te. He's the sitting vice president, obviously a member of the ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP, the one that wants formal independence. So China has been piling pressure on them for years. It has cut routine government-to-government talks with Taiwan. It has visibly backed the DPP's opponents in every local and presidential election. And now it wants to ensure that the sitting VP does not come to power. But how is this related to the Foxconn probe? Through this man, Terry Goh, another presidential candidate, an opponent of the DPP, and the founder of Foxconn. He tried to run in the 2020 election as well on a Kuomintang ticket. Kuomintang is Taiwan's main opposition party, seen as more conciliatory towards Beijing. So China keeps backing it. But Terry Goh failed to become the Kuomintang presidential candidate in 2020. So this time around, he's decided to go solo, to stand as an independent candidate. And this is a problem for Beijing. If Terry Goh contests alone, he will split the opposition vote. And the ruling party is already leading in opinion polls. A vote split would ensure their victory. And that's the worst case scenario for Beijing, which is why it has put pressure on Foxconn to get their founder Terry Goh to drop out of the presidential race. And this is not a hypothesis or an exaggeration, whatever I've just told you. Beijing has accidentally admitted to this through their state mouthpiece, the Global Times. Look at their recent report. It cites unnamed experts, and they say the Foxconn investigation may impact Taiwan's elections. Of course, China later refuted this report. It says the Foxconn probe is unrelated, that the tax inspections are all routine, and several companies are under the scanner. So is Foxconn. But here's a problem. These several companies have not been named. Only Foxconn has been named. And China is known for election interference. Taiwan's politicians have been quick to react to this. Here's what the frontrunner, the vice president, had to say.
During an election, China does not need to put pressure on Taiwanese companies, demanding they declare a position or even that they directly support a candidate they prefer, because this is a behavior where both sides can only lose.
And what about the Foxconn founder? What has Terry Goh said? Apparently, he's gone under the radar. Foxconn shares have been bleeding in the markets. They've lost more than 5% of their value in 2 days. That means Goh is losing millions of dollars every day. And that's a good reason to go underground and wait for all of this to blow over. Meanwhile, the opposition party, the Kuomintang party, has been relatively quiet. Perhaps they know that if they comment, they will be seen as pro-Beijing. And it has cost them in the last 2 elections. They don't want to risk a third one. Now, staying with China, let's look at its other diplomatic endeavors. Even though it's bullying Taiwan, it is also courting Taiwan's biggest backer, the United States of America. Now, it's no secret that Sino-US ties have hit a rocky patch. And that's an understatement. But while the jibes and condemnation take place in public, in private, there's been a lot of shuttle diplomacy. The US and China have been holding a string of high-level visits in recent months, all to gear up for a potential meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. And that meeting is expected soon. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is visiting the US tomorrow. He'll meet Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. This should set the groundwork for Xi Jinping to visit the US next month. And the Chinese president himself has issued a statement now. He says that China is willing to cooperate with the US. Here's our report.
The China-US relationship is chaotic. It tends to blow hot and cold. Last night, there was almost a warm, fluffy glow surrounding these ties. Chinese President Xi Jinping sent a letter with some hopeful words America's way. He said China was willing to cooperate with the US. Both sides had to manage their differences and work together to respond to global challenges. He wants stable Sino-US ties built on mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. All very poetic. Xi's letter wasn't completely optimistic, of course. He did mention a right way to get along and how it was crucial for the world. But overall, the letter ignited hopes of a potential meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. We'll get to that meeting in a moment. But before that, we should clarify that Xi's letter wasn't addressed to Biden. It was sent to an American non-profit organization dedicated to Sino-US relations. For years, the organization was led by Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State who actually forged America's relations with China. Kissinger has usually been lauded by China, so maybe Biden and his team shouldn't give Xi's letter too much importance. But nonetheless, it does signal a thaw in the frosty ties. That's something both Washington and Beijing have been working towards. Every month, you see a high-level bilateral meeting. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken went to Beijing in June. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen went in July. China's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, has been meeting American officials continuously, and he'll meet them again tomorrow in Washington.
During his visit to the United States, Foreign Minister Wang Yi will have in-depth exchanges of views with the top US officials on China-US relations. Also international and regional issues of common concern, as well as friendly exchanges with people from all walks of life in the US, in order to make clear China's principal position and legitimate concerns on China-US relations. We hope that the US side will work with the Chinese side.
The hopes are that Wang Yi's visit will pave the way for the big event, a meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in the US next month. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit is taking place in San Francisco in about 3 weeks. Both Washington and Beijing seem to want Xi to attend it and meet Biden on the sidelines. But while it seems that their goals are aligned, the antics and posturing by both sides may still play spoiler. The US has imposed new chip export controls on China. It's also released a report on China's military activity, which Beijing didn't take kindly to at all.
First of all, this US report is the same as similar reports it released earlier. It ignores facts, it is full of bias and spreads the China threat theory in order to make excuses for maintaining its own military hegemony.
That scathing attack was from a few days ago. It shows how tenuous the situation is, and how there's no guarantee that the Biden-Xi meet will take place. But even if it does, will anything meaningful come out of it?
Vantage continues after a short break.
असर नहीं होगा यहाँ ये इतनी ये these glasses are bomb.
Well, you can see that's outside the door, but the ceiling that is over the area where the ambulances come in.
Please show me.
Is also built to a higher fortified dimension.
देखिए ये भी fortified है.
It provides protection.
ये भी जब एम्बुलेंस से मरीजों को लाया जाता है तो ये भी फोर्टिफाइड है, यानी इतना मजबूत है कि बॉम्ब और रॉकेट का असर नहीं होगा, इस तरीके से बनाया गया. तो यहाँ भी लोग छुपेंगे. और ये ग्लासेस जो हैं ये बुलेट प्रूफ हैं, स्प्लिंटर प्रूफ है. हम आपको
incoming patients and healthcare workers are provided protection as
तो
they.
सबको प्रोटेक्शन मिलेगा, जो चाहे इंजर्ड हो, जो सोल्जर हैं, जो आम नागरिक हैं या आम लोग हो, यहाँ के स्टाफ हो, अगर यहाँ वो हैं तो जो इलाज की पूरी कार्रवाई होती है उस पर कोई असर नहीं होगा। और हम सबसे इजराइल और किसी देश के बॉर्डर के बीच में, इजराइल और बाकी देशों के बीच जो बॉर्डर है उसके सबसे नज़दीक के अस्पताल में है। और कह सकते हैं कि जो दूसरा वॉर फ्रंट है यानी लेबनान इजराइल बॉर्डर का, उसके सबसे नज़दीक के अस्पताल में भी हैं और वैसी जगह पे हैं जो कि बॉम्ब और रॉकेट से सुरक्षित है। यहाँ रॉकेट और मिसाइल का असर नहीं हो सकता। इजराइल हर तरफ से विवादित बॉर्डर से घिरा हुआ है और इस वक्त हम लोग एक ऐसे बॉर्डर पे हैं जहां इस वक्त झड़प चल रही है और कभी भी बड़े युद्ध की शक्ल ले सकती है। ये देखिए गैलीली मेडिकल सेंटर है, नहारिया शहर में है। नहारिया शहर में ये बड़ा मेडिकल अस्पताल है और उसके इमरजेंसी डिपार्टमेंट में है। यहाँ लाने का मकसद ये है कि ये सबसे बड़ा अस्पताल है जो इजराइल के किसी भी बॉर्डर से, कई दुश्मन देश हैं इजराइल के, कई देशों से इजराइल की लड़ाई है हर बॉर्डर पे, लेकिन ये सबसे करीब का अस्पताल है। 10 किलोमीटर से कम के अंदर में ये अस्पताल है। यहाँ से लेबनान बॉर्डर दिखता है और ये इमरजेंसी वार्ड, आपको बता दे, ये इमरजेंसी वार्ड है। और ये जो इलाका है इमरजेंसी वार्ड में, अगर बॉम्बिंग भी हो, मिसाइल
Our next story is about misplaced priorities, aka Pakistan. On the one hand, you have the PIA, the Pakistan International Airlines. It's the flag carrier of the country, but right now it's carrying no one. Why? Because the airline cannot pay for fuel. On the other hand is the Pakistan Army. And guess what they're doing? Testing out their missiles. I'm talking about this one, the Gauri weapons system. Pakistan's army tested this missile on Tuesday. They say the test was successful. Soon everyone lined up to congratulate the army, including the Prime Minister and the President. And why not? It's not like there is a crippling financial crisis in the country. We'll tell you why this attitude is a problem. But first, some details about Gauri. It's a medium-range ballistic missile. It was developed and tested in 1998. The Gauri can carry conventional and nuclear warheads. Its range is between 1,300 and 1,500 kilometers. It's a rather old missile system. It travels with a group of support vehicles. Without them, this missile cannot be launched. And in a battlefield, that's not ideal. You need a missile system that is nimble, that is difficult to track and attack, not a convoy of vehicles. In fact, Pakistan doesn't rely much on Gauri anymore. Their new pick is the Shaheen missile. So why test the old one now? The army says it's all about preparedness. A similar test was done last week as well. The Ababil missile was test fired. Now this is more advanced. It has a range of more than 2,200 kilometers. It can also carry multiple warheads. The Ababil is important for Pakistan's deterrence. Experts say Pakistan cannot compete with India's missile systems, so this missile is like their best bet. It can hit several targets at the same time. Of course, testing all these missiles is expensive, but that's never stopped Pakistan. For them, the military is paramount. Pakistanis can go hungry, But the army must be well funded. Such misplaced priorities have landed Pakistan in this crisis. We mentioned that their airline, the national carrier, at the beginning, the PIA, they've cancelled 322 flights in 10 days. Apparently, there is no fuel. Pakistan's state oil company has cut off the PIA. They want the airline to pay the dues first. Just one problem though, the airline does not have the money. In the last financial year, the PIA was in the red. They lost $291 million, and the losses are not just recent. Since 2012, PIA's losses are worth $7 billion, $7 billion in 11 years, losses. It is bleeding money. That's why Pakistan's government has decided to sell it off. They want to privatize the PIA, but at this rate, there may not be a company left to sell. Because cancelling 300 flights is not a sign of distress, it is a sign of collapse. Thousands of passengers have been affected by this. The PIA has not even given them an alternative. Yet the missile tests continue. It sums up why Pakistan is where it is. Their focus was always on India, on the imaginary threat from across the border. The fact is, India has never attacked Pakistan. The attacks have always come from the other side. So Pakistan's arms race was both unnecessary and costly. It's one of the reasons why the country is broke. Instead of correcting that mistake, Pakistan is doubling down. If only passengers could ride missiles instead of planes, this wouldn't be a problem for them now. Now let's turn our attention to Africa, specifically the city of Springs in South Africa. It is located east of Johannesburg. In the mid-20th century, it became the largest single gold-producing area in the world. And the mining of gold sustains the city to this day. But it's also led to a gold mine of issues. On Sunday evening, more than 500 gold miners went to work. But they did not return on Monday or Tuesday. And this morning, on Wednesday, only about 100 miners finally resurfaced. So what happened down there? The police say these miners are being held hostage. By whom? Members of a rival union. Yes, it is as dramatic as it sounds. Our next report tells you more.
Looks like quite the party, right? Wait till we tell you about the occasion. It's a celebration of holding hundreds of colleagues hostage. Now, workplace politics is taxing, but kidnapping colleagues to get your way? That sounds like a bit of a stretch. According to the South African police, that's exactly what happened here. These workers are gold miners. They belong to AMCU, the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union. It's an unregistered union of miners in South Africa. It represents a minority of employees at a gold mine in Springs, a city east of Johannesburg. The union wants to be formally recognized, but the management of the mine refuses to do so. It already has a recognized legitimate mining union, the NUH, or National Union of Mine Workers, whose members form the majority. On Sunday evening, 562 NUH members went to work at the city's gold mine, but they didn't resurface the next morning, or the one after that. That's because they were being held hostage by the rival union. During this incident, scuffles broke out underground. One person was seriously injured. When the mine sent a paramedic and security officer to rescue him, both were also held hostage. This is according to the police and NUH management. Meanwhile, the rival union, the AMCU, disagrees. They claim workers of both unions are merely staging a protest underground.
Don't react, comrade. Don't give them a reason. We know they attack only peaceful people. There are zamazamas all over with guns here. These police are nowhere to attack those zamazamas. They only want us.
Those underground can't confirm what's happening because all contact has been cut off. But finally, today morning, about 100 miners resurfaced. Apparently, they had to fight their way out. Upon release, they confirmed that fellow NUH members were in fact being held hostage. You see, the rivalry between these two unions is not new. It even contributed to one of South Africa's most horrific mining episodes. In 2012, violence broke out between striking mining unions. Initially, 6 mine workers and 2 security officials were killed. But then the violence escalated, resulting in the deaths of 34 mine workers who were shot by the police. This was one of the worst mass shootings by the South African police since the end of apartheid. It's been a decade since, but the turf war continues. Now, those being held hostage have a gold mine of problems. They can only hope that history doesn't repeat itself.
Our next story features Indonesia, one of the many regional players facing the China threat and the PLA's aggression on the high seas. Now, Indonesia is joining hands with India to deal with this. Multiple high-level meetings are being planned. Indonesian officials could travel to New Delhi as early as next month. On the agenda is a port, the Sabang port. It's close to India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands, some 710 kilometers away. It's an existing port, an old port. It needs some upgrades. And India is keen to help Indonesia. They've been exchanging notes. Earlier this year, there was a joint feasibility study, an assessment of the port's potential and how it can be unlocked. Turns out this port has a lot of strategic value. Just look at its location. It is near the Malacca Strait, some 500 kilometers away. And what is the Malacca Strait? A narrow stretch of sea falling between Indonesia and Malaysia. This strait is a choke point for China. You see, China gets most of its energy from overseas. In 2021, 70%, more than 70% of the crude oil used in China was imported. And most of this oil comes via the Malacca Strait. It is the shortest sea route between West Asia and East Asia. So China cannot lose access to this route. Its energy supplies will be compromised. You may have heard about this before. Experts call it China's Malacca dilemma, a big weakness for Beijing. And India may now have a way to exploit it by gaining access to the Sabang port. The feasibility study has not been made public, so we don't know what the report says, but in the past, leaders have spoken about this. In 2018, an Indonesian minister said that if this port is developed further, it could accommodate more vessels, including both commercial ships and submarines. So it could become a dual-use port. A port that can be used for both civilian and military purposes, dual use. And India's interest in Sabang is not new. In 2018, in fact, there was talk of Indian investment in the port, but that plan never materialized. Now there is fresh momentum and more proposals in the mix. Reports say India and Indonesia want more trade routes. They want to boost air connectivity. And one more idea is up for discussion. This is a completely different proposal, connecting Port Blair in the Andamans with Aceh, a province in western Indonesia. So Jakarta is not just looking for investment, it wants more synergy with India, something that potentially leads to deeper defense and maritime cooperation. And by doing this, their president is walking a tightrope. His name is Joko Widodo. Last month, he hosted the Chinese premier. He was promised new investments. China said it would put in more than $21 billion into Indonesia. In the month of July, Widodo met Chinese President Xi Jinping. Again, more promises were made. Xi Jinping pledged investments close to worth $45 billion. Then why is Indonesia betting on India if so much money is coming from China? Because Jakarta has its own challenges with Beijing. There is a territorial dispute. This is over the Natuna Islands. These are near the volatile South China Sea. China does not claim these islands, but it says it has maritime rights in the surrounding waters. And this includes the right to fish. Indonesia rejects these claims, and the two sides have had military encounters over this. China has used its coast guard to bully Indonesia, and Jakarta has responded by boosting its military presence near the islands. It has also undertaken economic projects. And recently, Indonesia tried a new approach. It tapped the local fishermen in the region. They're being encouraged to fish near the islands to challenge China's claims. Now, given this backdrop, there is a strategic opening for India here. In recent years, India has also expanded its influence in the ASEAN, a bunch of 10 Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN. Earlier, India was hesitant to engage. It was shy of taking an active role in the region, but now there is a shift. India wants deeper defense partnerships with regional players. It is supplying weapons to Southeast Asia, and Indonesia is part of this outreach. A new port will add to India's growing influence. Social media companies face hundreds of lawsuits. They've been filed by governments, school districts, families, and even young people. And many of them protest a singular phenomenon, the impact of social media on mental health. Now, a new lawsuit has joined this pile. 41 US states have sued Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram. They say Meta contributes to mental health crisis among the youth. And this is the biggest action against the company. But what will it yield? Experts say social media is harmful, especially to children. Governments agree, social media companies disagree, parents are scared. But the question remains, why is it so hard to reach a conclusion? Why is it so difficult to regulate social media? Our next report tells you.
This is the US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. In the month of May this year, he issued a grave warning. He said that social media is harmful to your mental health, especially if you're a teen. Normally, products deemed unhealthy for children are outlawed, like cigarettes and alcohol. So why isn't social media under heavy regulation? That's because of a little thing called expressive speech. That's what social media falls under. Now, it's not enough for experts or governments to claim that social media is unhealthy. They also need to regulate it. That means bans and age limits. But it's easier said than done. The governments must convince the courts. For that, they need evidence. And therein lies the problem. There's nothing conclusive. Many reports say that social media is bad for the mental health of teens and children, like this one from 2021. It says social media affects the self-esteem and well-being of children. Another study from last year says teenage social media use is linked to less life satisfaction. But some reports also claim the opposite. A study by Oxford published this year claims there's no evidence that the global spread of Facebook is linked to widespread psychological harm. In short, correlation is not causation. And governments face an uphill battle to find irrefutable proof. What's the result? So far, policymakers have failed to pass constructive privacy and safety protections for children pertaining to social media. So instead, they've ushered in political reckoning against social media companies. The EU is forcing big tech to regulate content through new sweeping laws. US states like Arkansas and Utah have banned people under 13 from social media without parental consent. A California law demands tech companies build social media guardrails. Parents and school districts the world over have filed hundreds of lawsuits too, claiming social media worsens the mental health of teens and children. And now, US states have taken their biggest action yet. 41 states have sued Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, for contributing to the mental health crisis among the young. This is by using addictive features to trap users and collecting data on children.
As our state's chief law enforcement officer, and as a parent, there is nothing more important to me than ensuring the well-being of our children. And we know that in the era of social media, their mental health has never been more at risk. That's why today I'm joining dozens of other attorneys general across the United States in a massive undertaking to once and for all hold Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, and its CEO Mark Zuckerberg, accountable for the deceptive practices and years of harm they have brought upon our young people.
If Meta is found guilty, there will be a number of potential consequences, like civil penalties and changes in business practices. But the question is, will simply demanding change from social media companies and fining them be enough? It's almost like urging oil companies to stop climate change, or cigarette companies to make their packaging unappealing. Decades ago, cigarettes were marketed as healthy products. This is shocking today, but how did this change? Because governments stepped in, just like they need to do in the case of social media companies. But regulating big tech is no small feat, and we as users must also share some responsibility. After all, they call it the doom scroll for a reason.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. As Hurricane Otis barrels down on Mexico, satellite images show lightning in the eye of the hurricane. And speaking of light, 1,000 drones lit up the night in New York Central Park. In South Korea's Seoul, ahead of Halloween, a crowd safety drill is now underway. This comes after more than 150 people died in a deadly crush amid Halloween celebrations last year. And finally, what makes today significant? Walk into almost any kitchen and it is likely that one appliance is sitting on the kitchen counter. I'm talking about the microwave oven. On October 25th, 1955, the first domestic microwave oven went on sale. Here's a fun fact. Microwaves were born of radar systems used in the Second World War. We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
마지막 단계인 22명입니다. 가족 30제곱미터당 지금
신고하고 있습니다. 사람을 따라
가족인터가 감지되어 있습니다.
질서 있게 앞사람을 따라서
Welcome, you're watching Breaking on News 18. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Let's dive into the segment with some breaking inputs coming in. We are now learning that after petrol bomb was hurled outside Raj Bhavan in Tamil Nadu, the governor's office has written to the Commissioner of Police